Good day to you. And what's your system like in the morning? What's your system like in the morning? Do you have to have coffee, for example? Or are you a person that if you don't have coffee, you're grouchy, something doesn't feel right inside, you don't feel awake, you got to have your coffee? Are you a person who has to have your newspaper? Not too many people like that today. It's mostly an older generation. I'm that kind of person. I got to have a newspaper. If I don't have a newspaper in the morning and know at least what the headlines are and see if there's any local people I know who are in the news, find out if there's anything unusual going on building-wise around campus, find out if there's any weather problems on the way. If I don't see that every single morning in the format of a newspaper laid out on the counter with my tea next to it, my morning feels kind of strange. You see, we all have systems to our mornings, and whether it's taking showers, taking baths, wearing sweat clothes, getting out of the door 10 minutes before class, getting out of the door half an hour before class, riding as opposed to walking, putting on clothes that are put out for you the night before, whatever your system is for getting ready in the morning, you have a system. And you have a system, maybe not so much by choice, but sometimes by habit. It's what you're used to, and it helps you get ready for the day. And that's very, very similar to the way that media operate as well, getting ready for the day. They have a system. There's a system that helps a media organization run. The system, though, occurs at much more intense levels than putting on your clothes or getting coffee in the morning. The system is made up of elements. And elements are those individual pieces that you can take a look at to start to understand what the whole system is about. But here's the deal. The system has interrelated parts, and that means that when you move one part, it affects another part, which affects another part, which affects another part. Just like the coffee example, if you don't have your coffee, are you grouchy? Are you automatically changed because you're not taking in one element, coffee, that you're used to in your system? And that's the way that media operate as well. And that's why I've laid out the book this way. I've laid out media by looking at media systems. And each country has its own media system. And as part of each media system, I look at nine elements. I look at 9 elements that you can look at individually to understand what the system breaks down into. Just like if you want to understand your morning and how it's going, break it down and see if all of the elements of your system that are usually there are there. And in order to help us see this in a more visual way, because the system and that whole idea can be very abstract, it actually comes from sociology and psychology, thinking about things in abstract terms to understand a whole. That's what a system really is. But in order for us to avoid not really getting a good concrete view of a system, I use the tree metaphor in the book, as you know. And even though this is a bush right here, or a potted plant, I should say, it still will help us take a look at how a media system operates as a tree. Okay, so let's take a look at the first idea, which is the elements of a media system. And when you have elements of a media system, you have parts, and each one of those parts affects other parts. And some parts are more important than other parts, or some parts are bigger than other parts. So there are certain associations between a couple parts, like 2 parts go together really well, whereas 2 other parts don't go together so well. So when you think about a system this way, and you think about how the elements are not always equal, but they're still there as definable units, now you're starting to have a sophisticated understanding of media as well, because media systems are enormously complicated entities with elements, not all of which have the same equality, or not all of them that are affected in the same way. But the most important element, by far, and it's not even the one that we study first in this class, we kind of have to build up to it, but the most important element, and the reason I'm mentioning it first here, is the media content. That is an element of a media system. It's the content. It's what most people think of when they think of a media system, because that's what they come into contact with. The content is the TV show, it's the web page, it's the newspaper, it's the magazine article, it's the movie, it's the song on the radio. That's the content. In the tree's terms, the content is what you see. It's the first thing you see. Like when you look at this entity, I mean, you may be looking at the pot just because of the way that this video camera is shooting it, but most people, when they see a tree, they see the leaves. From far away or close up, it's the leaves that stand out. So on a tree, content is going to represent the leaves. And content is ultimately what we're going to be focusing most of our attention on, because that's what most people look at. So let's try and figure out what that means to the effect of content on the way that we are, the way that we think, the way that we believe. That's rhetorical, by the way. Remember that word rhetoric? That's rhetorical. It's analyzing meaning all of the time, and it's saying that nobody's meaning is better than anybody else's meaning. So again, this chapter does raise the idea that this is a rhetorical book. It has a rhetorical perspective. It's about meaning. You have to argue what the meaning is, and nobody's right and nobody is wrong. Anyway, back to these elements. Got a little bit off track there. The very first one, media content, is out of the way. Now let's go in a more of a chronological order, the way that the elements are going to be discussed in the book. It's going to be the next chapter that we move to after we finish with this one. And the next one that we're going to come to is the element that's called cultural characteristics. And cultural characteristics are what's underneath the tree, or the pot in this case, or the potted plant in this case. It's something you can't see. The cultural elements are down there, underground. You got to get to them. They're very, very finely laid into life. They're very finely textured into life, cultural characteristics. So we got to dig down deep to go find them. And it has to do with the things that are around where a media system grows up, like physically close, like a Stroudsburg for here, Water Gap, even in New York City. That's where cultural characteristics are influencing the growth of not only just people, but media systems. So that's kind of what that gets at. And then the next element after that we move on to is philosophies for media systems. Because within cultural characteristics, a government and the people and businesses and the whole fabric of society starts to develop a philosophy for how its own particular media system should run. And every country has different philosophies. You'll find that out as we get into that chapter. But that's also an element that's below the surface. You can't see it. You have to dig. Dig for philosophy. Dig for cultural characteristics. All right, the next element of a media system that we're going to be talking about is what is known as regulation. Regulation is now where we're starting to pop out of the ground. We're starting to see the tree in its obvious form above ground. And so regulation is referred to as the trunk of a tree, that sturdy part. It's what holds a tree up. It's what gives it its basic direction. That's regulation. Regulation comes in the form of laws, comes in the form of government dictates. It comes in the form of advertiser-imposed regulations. Regulation just has to do with the way that media have to behave according to a certain set of rules that are out there, and those rules are controlled by a powerful entity. We'll be getting more into that, but that's regulation. It's the next element that we talk about in this book. And then after we talk about regulation, the next thing that we talk about is accessibility of media. Accessibility of media has to do with what you were able to get to and what you were able to get to easily. Like, I can get to this leaf really easily. It's right next to my face. It's a piece of media content that would be like turning on the TV and the first channel that comes up is this leaf right here. It's right there. It would be like that newspaper that's right on the edge of the table that you just reach over and grab. It's just right there. Other media content is not as accessible. It's like, I have to look around the back of this tree to see what's around there. And if it was a really tall tree, I wouldn't even be able to see some of the content. It would be so inaccessible. And that's the way it is for media. What media do you have to drive to get? You have to go drive to get a New York Times if you want a New York Times? What about if you want a Philadelphia Inquirer? Where could be the closest one you could find, even though this is Pennsylvania? Probably. I don't think Wawa carries it. I don't think CVS carries it. I think you have to go to a news agent if you can find one. There is one on Crystal Street in East Stroudsburg, or you're driving to the airport in Allentown before you can find it at Philadelphia Inquirer. And then what about a Los Angeles Times or a Chicago Tribune or a British newspaper like The Sun or an Israeli newspaper or Venezuela? I mean, now you're talking about inaccessible media, right? And if you're going to get it, it's going to be really, really expensive. So you're paying $2 or $3 for a Philadelphia Inquirer, for a newspaper, or for a Lebanese paper, you're paying $6. Now all of a sudden, it's becoming less and less accessible. And then there's even some media content that's just not accessible. You just can't get to it. Like there's I'm sure a French TV channel that we just can't get here in the United States. So accessibility of media is another element that we take a look at in this book. Yet another element that we take a look at in this book and this class is financing. This is a really interesting element, financing of media. Who pays for media? Where does it come from? Financing is represented by smaller branches on here. Financing is represented by branches because financing determines a lot of the shape of the content. If you have, for example, advertising as your financing, you know that within your half-hour TV program, you're going to have to take out major chunks for the advertisers, just like the Super Bowl a couple of nights ago, except that this is a situation where people are paying a lot of attention to the financing because the content, the commercials, are heralded by our society as being a show within a show of the latest, greatest, funniest, well, at least in years past, these ones weren't that funny for the Super Bowl, but the roll-out commercials that demonstrate the biggest, boldest ideas, it's still financing. And it's still interrupting the overall event, which is the Super Bowl or a TV show. So you're taking out whole chunks, 10 minutes sometimes, of a half an hour, and changing that. That changes the content, changes the philosophy about program, changes a lot. Now you're seeing that chain reaction, I hope, that I started class out with the getting ready for the morning example with. All right, we still have a couple more pieces of elements. There's a couple more elements to talk about. One is leaves or content. I've already talked about that. But within leaves, there's very specific leaves that are different from other leaves. Like these ones, right? These are brown. And if you look at these leaves, you would say they're not healthy. In this part of the tree where I got them off the bottom, there's something that needs some attention there. Maybe I just need to pick them. Maybe it needs some water. And in fact, that's what it did need. I had to water it this morning. So the leaves that are different on a tree, they are analogous to the media element of news reporting. News reporting is how the health of a country appears to the population because the news basically tells you a lot of murders, a lot of things being built, a lot of good economic news, a lot of unwanted pregnancies, a lot of interracial conflict in small or big cities. That's how you tell whether your country is healthy in some ways, by the leaves that are different on the media system. In this case, these broken down leaves are saying there's some parts of this bush, this potted plant, that's not healthy. News reporting is a chapter that we'll get to later in the class that speaks to the element of news reporting. And that takes us to our last two now, and the last two are imports and exports. That's actually one. Imports and exports as one of the two remaining elements. And this is the idea that when you have a media system, it has seeds, and those seeds go to other countries. So they take up other residencies in other countries. A lot of our TV shows air all over the world every single night, like The Voice, which is coming back on for another season. The show where singers are evaluated, that show is going to be seen in Britain. It's going to be seen in Canada. It's going to be seen in Paris. A lot of our comedies are seen all over the world. Big Bang Theory is seen in Britain. It's seen in probably Mexico. It's seen in lots of different places. So exports leave a country as well. Newspapers that go on airplanes with travelers, they get left in other countries. Films debut all over the world from the United States. So there are just a lot of different ways that media are exported from the U.S. And the U.S. takes in imported media. It takes in imported media. For example, we get a lot of British shows, like British singers, like Ed Sheeran, for example, is one that comes to mind. He's a singer. He's British. He's English. He's singing all over our radio right now. And the same is true for Canadians. We have Canadian singers. We have Canadian actors. We don't get so much Canadian newspapers. We don't get so many Mexican radio programs. It's going to kind of be a theme that we'll discuss later on when we get to that chapter. But imports and exports has to do with how much a country sends media out and how much a country receives media in. And then that takes me to the final element, the element of you and me, which is to say the audience, who I also refer to in this chapter as passers-by. The audience are the people that go by the tree, take a look at the tree, decide what leaves they're going to look at, decide whether they're going to think about what's underneath, decide whether they're going to try and get to the other side and see if there's media that they hadn't thought of that they could pay for or they could travel a little farther for to pick up. That's the media audience. How is the media audience affected by the particular media system that they access by living most of their life in the United States or France or China, Britain, all of the countries in this book and all of the countries that exist in the world? How are you affected by the media system that grows up uniquely within your country because you have unique cultural characteristics, unique philosophies, everything's unique about your country. Of course, there are similarities. The Canadians and the U.S. both speak English, similarities, but you have a uniqueness in your country which shapes the media system, which is accessed by people in the country, and it has a profound effect on the way that they think and feel. And that's what we'll be exploring as we continue on with the class. For now, this wraps up the chapter on elements of a media system. Have a great day.